Introduction. So I'm Kavitha Arora. I'm the Division Director for General OBGYN at UNC in Chapel Hill, and I'm honored to be the Greenwall Fellow in Bioethics here at the NAM and the current chair for the National Ethics Committee for the American College of OBGYNs. And of note, it has actually reissued guidance recently on immunizations, pandemics, and research in pregnant and lactating persons. This session is structured a little bit more uniquely than some of our other sessions. So we have two initial amazing speakers to help frame two very unique case studies, and then a separate panel to reflect and discuss to follow. And the goal is to use these two case studies of lessons learned in both mental health and COVID-19 to apply or scale up approaches in other areas. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our first speaker, Dr. Catherine Weisner. She's the Norman and Helen Asher Professor of Psychiatry, Behavioral Sciences, and OBGYN, as well as the Director of the Asher Center for Research and Treatment of Depressive Disorders at Northwestern University. Further information about her can be found on page 24 of your meeting materials, and I look forward to her discussing Case Study 1, Lessons Learned from Drug Trials for Mood Disorders. Dr. Weisner.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kavita. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Can you pull up my, yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so my topic is lessons learned from drug trials and mood disorders. I have no conflicts of interest to report. Is this going quickly again? Okay, so I wanted to speak a bit about the importance and the scope of perinatal mood disorders. I did a study in which I screened 10,000 women in the 4 to 6 week time frame postpartum. And in that population, when I screened with the depression measure, 1 of 7 or 14% of those pregnant people or post-pregnant people had a positive screen. And when we evaluated those women who had a positive screen, the vast majority had major depression with a coexisting anxiety disorder. Another 20% of those women had mostly undiagnosed bipolar illness. The onset of the illnesses that we picked up at 4 to 6 weeks postpartum were a mix of chronic illnesses that existed through pregnancy, diseases that onsetted in pregnancy, and then that burst of cases in the post-birth period between 4 to 6 weeks. So these disorders are incredibly common in women. The American College of OBGYN put forth a consensus document on managing these illnesses in obstetrical practice. And I want to read their statement because it's profound. Perinatal mood and anxiety disorders are associated with increased risks of maternal and infant mortality and morbidity and are recognized as a significant patient safety issue. All of the negative outcomes that we think about in obstetrics and neonatology are more common in mothers who have these illnesses during pregnancy. Obstetric complications, neonatal complications, long-term difficulties, psychopathology in the infants, and therefore the need to treat these patients has become a prominent consideration recently. About 3 to 8%, an average of 5% of women are exposed to serotonergic antidepressants. So again, an incredibly common problem in this field. It's not advancing. Can you advance it for me? Thank you. So the first case I called Silos and Stigma. I have a grant to repurpose mirtazapine for severe nausea and vomiting in pregnancy. Mirtazapine, or Remeron, is FDA indicated as an antidepressant for the treatment of major depressive disorder. My interest in this drug is that it's used off-label for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, and also for pre-op administration to prevent post-op nausea and vomiting. And it's available as an orally disintegrating tablet for that purpose. I made the case in the grant that, like ondansetron, another anti-nausea and antiemetic, it antagonizes serotonin 5-HT3 receptors, but it also as I pictured in a diagram in the grant, has 3 other additional receptors that it affects to block the emetic cascade. So it makes a good candidate for repurposing for severe nausea and vomiting in pregnancy. So I want to talk about the study section review. So in the comments was, why would mirtazapine be used over ondansetron? Because they both antagonize this specific receptor. Interesting was the reviewer quote, which was, psychotropics should not be used without an indication. Interestingly, the ACOG guidelines for down-the-line treatments, not first-line, but down-the-line treatments for severe nausea and vomiting includes 2 psychotropic drugs, drugs that are indicated both for nausea and vomiting in pregnancy and for schizophrenia. The other comment was the value of this study is limited to women who have major depression and severe nausea and vomiting in pregnancy, which also is not the case because the receptors for these disorders are different. So it took me 4 submissions to provide the information to have this grant evaluated in a way that I think was productive and appropriate. Another review was that our team, which consisted of me in psychiatry and Kate Sticka, my colleague who's an OBGYN pharmacologist, that we have focused on mental health disorders of pregnancy and postpartum with less experience in more medical indications, as if it's not a medical indication. So my comment here is that members of scientific panels, IRBs, are affected by the same stigma, the same stimuli that result in stigma affect all of the people that review our studies, and that psychiatrically ill women who are also pregnant are doubly stigmatized. My second case is IRB hesitancy. So particularly in my field, medications are used chronically. Example is atypical antipsychotics like quetiapine, used to treat schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, but also methadone, buprenorphine, antiretrovirals. CYP3A4 metabolizes about 50% of drugs, and we know that its activity increases across pregnancy, so plasma levels of drugs can go down. So how do we deal with the fact that the activity increases, but we need to maintain patients on drugs from conception through the 40-week physiologic changes to the post-birth time? How do we figure the doses to keep these women stable? Probe drugs are a way to look at and assess the activity of these enzymes. A selective probe for CYP3A4 is mirtazapine, which is a benzodiazepine, a psychotropic. So Dr. Sticka, Kate Sticka, and I had the goal of understanding the activity of CYP3A4, and we wanted to do a probe study at the end of the first trimester, second and third trimester in healthy pregnant women. So to do this, you submit to the IRB, and in this particular case, there's no prospect of benefit to the fetus. The risk of the fetus has to be no greater than minimal risk, and you have to justify those in your applications, which we did. So our justification was based on a study by Weisner et al. From University of Washington, which we learned yesterday may have successful infrastructure in conducting these studies. So that group did 2 milligrams of midazolam at 28 to 32 weeks in pregnancy and compared their data for the activity of the CYP enzyme and found that, in fact, the clearance in pregnancy is more than twice that postpartum. So those drugs metabolized through that system are going to be cleared and the doses are going to be reduced. We also provided information that the mean plasma, the max, the Cmax, was 6.4 in that study with no adverse reactions in the mothers, no maternal sedation, and no changes in fetal heart rate. The maximum concentration of the Cmax for adult sedation is about 90 nanograms per ml, which is 14 times what was observed in the Weisner study. We also know that midazolam syrup, dose for adolescent sedation at 5.5 milligrams per kilo, develops a Cmax of about 118. So this 90 to 118 is the sedation level. So we then said, extrapolating to an approximately 65 kilogram woman, a 2 milligram dose is 0.03 milligrams per kilo. So we provided this information, and what was interesting is that it was initially not approved. We provided more justification. It was not approved by the IRB committee. What was interesting is that the vote in the committee, although the majority of the vote was don't approve it, there was a mixed discussion and disagreement about whether to improve it. And the issue was around the definition of minimal risk. So they weren't really concerned about the use of midazolam. What they were concerned about is, how do you take this definition of minimal risk, which I put here, which is complex. It sounds like it's a good operational definition. It means that the probability and magnitude of physical or psychological harm anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life, routine medical, dental, or psychological examinations. So the struggle they had was, how does pregnancy affect the application of this definition? And one of the things that we weren't able to get an answer to is, would there be a dose that would be considered qualifying for this definition? And regardless of whether you agree with their finding, the problem is, if this happens, where does one go? Perhaps if your study section or if your IRB committee didn't have an obstetrician or a pharmacologist, where do you go for additional help and review? So I'm going to finish with a poem that one of my patients gave to me. And as you read it and understand the incredible pain these women go through, I'll make the final statement that mental health is fundamental to health. Thank you. Misbehaving.
That's okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Weisner. Our next speaker is Dr. Ruth Karen. She's a professor of international health at Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. So please join me in welcoming her as we discuss case study 2, lessons learned from the COVID-19 vaccine trials. Dr. Karen?
So thank you so much, Kavita. Thank you all for having me. And I really wanted to thank Dr. Bianchi for setting the stage for what I'm going to talk about. I think you'll hear my views are very much my own. I will say that I think with respect to inclusion of pregnant and lactating people in studies to prevent death and disease from emerging infections, we've really reached a glass ceiling and we need a new remedy. So that, in short, is what I'm going to say. So I'd just like to take us back to the very beginning of the pandemic, March 2020, and where were we with respect to thinking about vaccines for pregnant people. First of all, as you've heard already, the PREGLAC recommendations had been developed and disseminated. And also, importantly, in the maternal immunization community, which is where I sit and many of our colleagues here sit, the value of maternal immunization was well recognized and many obstacles had already been addressed. And I think there was, although we can go back, there's a long history of maternal immunization. I think the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic was really a particular turning point because it spotlighted pregnancy as a high-risk condition, and it really emphasized the value of maternal influenza immunization. As of March 2020, there was one company that had already enrolled thousands of women in a trial of a maternal RSV vaccine, one of my pathogen very dear to my own heart. And there were two other companies that were similarly embarking on large phase 3 trials. So when we talk about liability and approaches to liability, these companies had actually solved this problem. And in addition, the PREVENT guidance, which was in your handouts and which I think many of you are familiar with, had already been developed and disseminated. So this guidance, for those of you who are not familiar, was something that with a host of really remarkable colleagues, Ruth Karen, Carly Krubner, and I led the charge in developing these recommendations, 22 recommendations across 3 domains to equitably and responsibly include the interests of pregnant people and their offspring in the development and delivery of epidemic vaccines. And in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were particular recommendations that we thought were very salient. The first was, this guidance was published in 2019. So it was when mRNA was more than a twinkle in everyone's eye, but it certainly hadn't reached its full expression. But we knew that new technologies were coming, and we said specifically that pregnant people should not be left behind as new technologies were developed. We said that we recognize that there are animal studies that need to be done often in advance of evaluation in pregnant people. They're DART studies is the term of art, and that those should be conducted early in clinical development as promising and appropriate candidates move to phase 2. We said that pregnant people should have the opportunity to enroll in studies conducted during outbreaks when the prospect of benefit was greater than risk for pregnant people, their offspring, or both. And then finally, in the context of an outbreak or epidemic response, pregnant people should be offered vaccines. So starting in April, in March was when WHO declared the pandemic. There were early and sustained calls for inclusion of pregnant people in clinical trials for COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics. I wanted to give a particular shout out to Apurva Mandavili of the New York Times, who was asking about this in early April. Colleagues, I actually looked to see what was the earliest journal article about this, and it was pretty early. It was in May 2020. Many of our colleagues, either here or listening in, wrote about this including Dr. Bianchi, and this is just, these are selections. This is not representative of the what I would call the full outcry, but there were multiple articles about the need for inclusion of pregnant people in these COVID vaccine trials. Oops. Yeah, and I just want to make, yeah, okay, sorry. And during this time, as things progressed, there were data accumulating on the risks of COVID-19, both for pregnant people and for their babies. These, again, are only a selection of some of those articles. And on the other hand, data accumulating on the benefits of vaccination, not only to the mothers, but to their infants, and most recently, in protecting infants against hospitalization. I think you may all be aware of those articles. So, in terms of a scorecard, we had the PREVENT guidance. What did we achieve? So, pregnant women were left behind as mRNA was developed. DART studies were not finished as of December 2020 when the first vaccines received their EUA. They were finished in the months thereafter, but pregnant people were not able to be enrolled because the DART studies were not completed. Pregnant people were not able to enroll in clinical trials. Some were started in 2021, but they couldn't, in the US at least, Enrollment was difficult to absent because people really didn't think we were in a position of equipoise anymore with respect to enrollment of pregnant people. And of course, pregnant people were offered vaccines, but I would contend that this was a delayed process. So I actually, Professor Brocklehurst said it better than I could. Dr. Bianchi said this before. This is, again, from something that's in your briefing booklet, but I just want to read it out and for us to just take a moment in thinking about this. Excluding pregnant women from the COVID vaccine trials has resulted in pregnant women dying needlessly. And I absolutely believe that to be true. On the left, you can see the information that the CDC keeps, which is important information to have, that is about uptake of COVID-19 vaccines in pregnancy. I really want to commend the providers and policymakers here, the people who sit on ACOG and the people who are on the front lines. I think particularly when the Delta wave hit and we learned so much about how that wave affected pregnant people, I think there were redoubled efforts on the part of these people to get pregnant people vaccinated, but still we lagged behind where we should have been. So from where I sit, what are the lessons for the future? So the first one, and I have to say, so I am a pediatrician who specializes in infectious diseases. I'm not an obstetrician, but I am an infectious disease person. And unless somebody tells me differently, I know of no infectious disease for which pregnant people are at lower risk than the general population. They're either at the same risk or they're at higher risk. So at minimum, they deserve fair access to clinical trials when benefits exceed the risks. And I think, of course, we're in a position where we should be considering double benefit. It is benefit to the mother, it is benefit to the baby. The second point is pregnant people are not lactating people and they're not children. And these are three distinct groups. And let me be really clear. I'm a pediatrician. No one is happier than I am at the events that have transpired at the FDA this week. But I actually think that co-designating all these populations as special populations actually didn't serve the interests of any. My experience, and I did speak to people in Operation Warp Speed, and I give them great credit for everything they did accomplish in 2020 and 2021. But what I heard was, oh, those are all special populations, we'll get to them. And the truth of the matter is, pregnant people were at much greater clinical risk than children. The clinical development plan for children was entirely different than the clinical development plan for pregnant people. And lactating people should have been vaccinated and in clinical trials from the outset because there's no biologic reason why this was a risk to lactating people. Okay. So third is that, and we were in an environment which, from my perspective, was favorable to maternal immunization and with sufficient financial resources. And those were insufficient to foster timely inclusion of pregnant people in COVID-19 vaccine trials during a public health emergency, even as historic efforts were made to enhance diversity and inclusion of other populations. So, again, from where I sit, legislative remedies should be considered to ensure fair inclusion of pregnant and lactating people in clinical trials. And just to point out that future epidemics and pandemics may actually increase the risk of inequity for pregnant people, because where we're sitting is that we want to speed things up. This is from CEPI and Gavi, speeding up vaccine development. Can we go from lab to jab in just 100 days? That is a wonderful aspiration, but if we can't figure out how we're going to achieve better equity for pregnant people, I think things will only get worse. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karen. I think we have a few minutes for questions. And so I want to start with just noting that for both case studies, it's really important to call out that the framework has shifted. So both of you give examples of, sort of the old ethical framework of the precautionary principle and being very mindful of the harms and being paternalistic about those harms. And really today and yesterday, and Maggie Little set this up beautifully, that really the framework needs to shift away from that into one of equity. And I'm just curious, from both of your experiences in both mental health and COVID-19, what will it take to get that framework to shift from a cultural perspective at the various levels, at the patient level, at the healthcare system level, and at the legal and regulatory levels?
So at a very large level in mental health work, we still have extensive difficulty with stigma to fight. I mean, I have colleagues who pay for their own care so they don't have to have it listed in their insurance. So stigma is still alive and well. And so then studying these illnesses, you're fighting this societal stigmatization. And there are programs and projects to reduce stigma, although it's very difficult because it's quite entrenched in American society. In terms of how do we advance from a regulatory standpoint, I think calling out the kinds of comments that were in the reviews and making sure that representatives in mental health or in psychopharmacology are on those committees to provide a perspective. I think that's important, both in study section reviews. I think it's the same thing is true in journal reviews, and also on IRBs. So I think we need to be very mindful about who is composing committees that are judging whether the research fits with the current thinking in handling these kinds of issues.
So I think I alluded to my thinking on this in what I said. I think there needs to be regulation on this issue, and probably don't need to say more than that.
Perfect. That leads me to my second question, right? So once we get past sort of the cultural shift is sort of the stick, as we talked about yesterday in a breakout session. So from your experience, whether it's the IRB or with the PREVENT trial and having recommendations on the books already, what are actionable sticks that you would imagine in either the regulatory space or the legal space that you feel would be specifically helpful and as the next step from your experience?
So again, back to IRBs, one of the strategies that would be useful, although not typically employed by IRBs, is to take a case like the one I had and actually go through a discussion of the decision-making process as an exercise in understanding why the committee is making the decision they are. Now, we got to that it was difficult to apply that particular definition, which sounds clear and operational on paper, but is difficult to apply. So I think taking the problems and developing IRB cases and then strategies within the IRB to manage those strategies, which would help then the investigator make an application and the team that's evaluating the application apply more well-considered strategies and maybe even make those policy. And it would be great if those could be shared across IRBs. And I'm intrigued with University of Washington's policy to see what they have done to make their efforts apparently more successful.
So I don't want to steal Lin Yao's thunder because you can see that that's coming up. I actually think that we could think about what Priya has done for us, how it has allowed us to think about these issues. And I think it's sort of percolated down. I think it's helped the regulators. I think it's helped companies probably after the initial shock wore off to sort of think about policies and processes. I actually think, for some of what I'm thinking about, IRBs are used to this. Maternal immunization is not new. And so I think that we're there in terms of some of that kind of support.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much for really drawing together so many of the themes we've been hearing about in terms of the ethical imperatives, stigma, equity, regulatory and legal barriers to change, and then the initial thoughts on how to leverage these two case studies for broader change. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, I now want to ask our panel to join me up here so we can reflect on these case studies as opportunities to scale up evidence generation across various health concerns. All right, let me start with introductions. So to my left is Dr. Geeta Swamy. She's an Associate Vice President for Research, the Vice Dean for Scientific Integrity, and Professor of OBGYN at Duke University. She'll be joining us today to present the perspective of the researcher. To her left is Dr. Iona Munjal. She's the Director of Clinical Research and Development for Pfizer Vaccines, as well as an Assistant Professor of Pediatrics at Albert Einstein College of Medicine and Montefiore Medical Center. She'll be presenting the viewpoint of industry. And to her left is Dr. Lynn Yao. She's the Director of the Division of Pediatric and Maternal Health at the FDA. She'll be presenting the regulatory perspective. And then to her left, Catherine Schubert is the President and CEO for the Society for Women's Health Research and will be presenting the patient perspective in advocating for pregnant and lactating persons' inclusion in clinical trials. Now that everyone has been introduced with their titles and affiliations, I'm actually going to switch to first names very intentionally for this panel to try to dismantle some of the hierarchy and really elevate the importance of the patient view for this conversation. So why don't we go down the line and ask each presenter to give us their initial thoughts and reflections from our amazing two case studies.
Thanks. So I think from the research perspective, and just full disclosure that I am a researcher in maternal immunization and in other infectious disease and perinatal diseases. So Ajoke, Ruth, and others in the room and I go back a ways at this point. And I can say that from that perspective, we have made a lot of strides in the regulatory space, in working with industry sponsors and working with IRBs. As someone who oversees the IRB at Duke Health, I have to say that one of the things that helped pave the way for us to be able to do things in a much more streamlined and efficient way was that our former lead IRB chair was a pediatric oncologist. Now, while that is not the same as pregnant people or caring for pregnant people, it's still a population that's at very high risk, very concerning, and in some ways rather seeking desperation, right, from families. And that gave the tone of the IRB a very different perspective, I think, for many, many years. The other thing is that it actually, the things that we've all been talking about here today, are what I think led me to a perspective of managing research and oversight and regulation, because I got tired of the same things. And when it came down to it, going to an IRB meeting and talking about what we were doing and why, led to what always happens is when they see you in that perspective, you get asked to be a part of it. So I encourage you to think that way about how you can be a part of it to provide that solution. The other thing is that we really have to get to a place where appropriately, politely, collegially, we are demanding accountability. It's different to say, let's send you this case study. Let's talk about all of the data and the articles and what's happening out there. But until we say, tell me what I should tell my patient because I don't have something to offer them because you won't let me do this study. And I mean that sincerely, like holding people accountable in a way that puts them in your shoes can help them to see the different perspective. We can do that respectfully, right? We can. We wouldn't have gotten to where we are today if we hadn't. And the other thing I want to just make a plug for, and all the things that we've been talking about, is that while I would like to think that I'm here because of some of my accomplishments, I also think I'm here because there are not many people like me or that do what I do. And there are a lot of people doing amazing research in pregnancy, in lactating individuals, in pregnancy outcomes, and infant outcomes. But there are not that many individuals doing research in pregnant women for conditions that are not associated with pregnancy. And it is a different perspective on how to navigate that. I will give a tremendous amount of credit to folks in the HIV and AIDS research world, because I have to say DAIDS really worked through a tremendous amount of this effort for a long time. But for whatever reason, that did not get a lot of attention in the United States, and likely because HIV now is a endemic condition in countries outside of the United States. But there have been people doing this, but not really recognized well from that perspective. So we really need to get to where we consider a training pipeline as well, from the standpoint of regulation, from the standpoint of understanding the population, from the standpoint of collaboration, scientific review, right? How do we think about this at FDA? Ruth mentioned the H1N1 trials. That was a tremendous success. On the other hand, we stopped, halted NIH-funded trials of H1N1 vaccine 3 times in a 4-week period because of preterm births occurring at 32 weeks, 36 weeks, 35 weeks, because other than me, the other investigators were adult infectious disease physicians doing studies at their sites already in adult patients. And of course, why would this pregnancy have delivered? It had to be associated with the product, right? And I'm thinking, well, no, because we have those things happen all the time. And rather than halting the study, the idea is to go to someone with the expertise and make sure that they're involved. So I do think that all the things we're talking about are what we need. But how do we put those into a way that becomes actionable and becomes a place where we hold people accountable to advance the health of women and children? Because at the moment, it's actually going the other direction in this country. So, just stop there.
Thank you so much. Iona?
Thank you so much. I'm Iona Manjal. I work at Pfizer's Clinical Vaccine Research and Development Division, which essentially is a group of clinicians that plan and execute our clinical trials. Pfizer currently has 3 maternal vaccines in late-stage development: COVID-19, GBS, which is in phase 2, and an RSV maternal vaccine, which is in phase 3. We've looked very intentionally across our portfolio and additionally have vaccines in early bacterial and viral stages of development that are specifically for this population. And we're really seeking to launch vaccines that address the health interest of maternal and infant populations, not really adapting our current portfolio to this population, although certainly seeking data in that way is important as well. I'll pivot a little bit to our RSV maternal program, because that is likely to be the first in our portfolio that could potentially be submitted. We expect to see final data outputs in the second half of this year. If that vaccine is submitted successfully, it would be the first vaccine license for the maternal population. It's something that we're very, very proud of, and certainly what gets me up in the morning. RSV obviously is a disease that affects children worldwide, and particularly in low and middle income countries. And so when we were designing the vaccine, we were not only designing it for a U.S. population, but for an ex-U.S. population. We're very excited to announce that as part of Pfizer's commitment to an Accord for a Healthier World, and in conjunction with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, both our GBS and RSV vaccines would be available at a cost acceptable to Gavi countries once we complete licensure. So As a result, in the RSV phase 3 study, we're not just U.S., we're ex-U.S. We're in 18 countries, including low and middle income countries, with over 200 sites. We certainly have had challenges recruiting a maternal population, but that was actually not because it was a maternal population. That's because we started in June of 2020 and there was a small pandemic going on. So we had to contend with that. We had to contend with women having less frequent visits to their obstetrician, and we had to contend with the fears associated with vaccination that came around during the pandemic. But what made us successful in launching all of our studies was lessons that we learned from our phase 2 studies, and I think a lot of them have really nicely been touched upon in this conference. Before we launched our vaccine, we certainly convened a panel of advisors to assess our protocol and on the scientific nature of the protocol. But we also actually convened a panel of pregnant women and pregnant participants, potential pregnant participants, and their partners. So we conducted hours-long interviews to see how the protocol would affect them, what the acceptability of the protocol would be, and how their partners would view them participating in a clinical trial. We used their insights to formulate the protocol, the duration of procedures in the protocol, and we convened study coordinators to actually map out the time that a pregnant participant could potentially be sitting in a clinic. Nobody wants to have a pregnant participant sitting for long hours. So our protocol in phase 3 was extremely intentional with these things in mind. We tried to widen the gestational age of the inclusion criteria as much as possible and make the conclusion criteria in our phase 3 trial reflect the women that were in the trial, including the allowability of controlled gestational diabetes and gestational hypertension, which actually in pregnancy are common conditions. People talked about recruitment materials. Our recruitment materials, we hope, reflected the diversity of the participants in our trial. And we used social media. We actually used social media sites to target the zip codes that we were in conducting the clinical trial to make women aware that the trial was available. We talked about diversity up front. We know what the U.S. Census data is. We went to zip codes where women that we wanted to participate lived. We engaged study champions who looked like the participants that we wanted to engage. We made them mentor our other clinical sites so that they could enroll, and we give regular feedback to our clinical trial sites to let them know if they are enrolling in the diversity of their zip code. And if they're not, we let them know that that's what Pfizer wants them to do. So we're very intentional in how we do that in our clinical trials. And then I can't say that we would be successful without the tremendous contribution of our data monitoring committee. I can't underscore, and I haven't really heard that come up in these panels before. Our data monitoring committee is set up as a committee of experts in obstetrics, maternal health, pediatrics, and pulmonary medicine, because we are an RSV trial. And their continued input, review, and guidance has allowed us, somebody very nicely said that this was a very emotional scientific endeavor, and it is. It's hard to see adverse events occurring in pregnant women and their children. And so the DMC brings a calm and a scientific rationality to that review of our data and allows them to very judiciously take their unblinded reviews to advise the sponsor on how to conduct the trial and whether or not we are doing everything safely. So really, I can't underscore that as well. And then finally, I would say that we haven't completed our phase 3 study, but we have completed our phase 2 study. And to further empower our clinical trial participants, we do give them an email at the end of the study that they can sign up for that contains the entirety of their data that we have collected on them and their infant throughout the trial to really empower them to be part of the study. And one of the major learnings we've had from COVID is to keep in touch directly with our trial participants and let them know if the trial is going to change and why. We let them know about our crossover designs in the COVID study and any changes that we have in our ongoing clinical trials. Thank you.
Lynn?
Thanks, Kavita. I'm going to, I think, need to advance these slides. Yeah, thanks. Okay. So in thinking about what I was going to say, I actually, late last night, changed everything. Because there is, I think, a smaller elephant. Maybe it's not an elephant. Maybe it's a giraffe. I don't know. In the room about what do we do to move forward? And you heard, I think, Ruth's conclusion that maybe there's a need for a legislative effort here. And I thought that I would use my time then to explain the brief history of the pediatric legislation. And I hope that helps to inform any discussions moving forward. So disclosures here in general, and of course, these represent my opinions. The second disclosure is that I am a pediatric nephrologist, not an OBGYN. And the third disclosure is that I am also not a political scientist or a historian. So you'll have to take that into account. I'm going to breeze through some of these slides, but I would hope that people can use them. I'm happy to circulate them. The important point about this slide is that fundamental to the development and the creation of the Food and Drug Administration are tragedies that occurred in children. Okay, so we have to remember that our most vulnerable, in this case, children are vulnerable populations, actually have led the way in terms of development of regulations. It was really recognized as early as the 1970s that we didn't have good information to inform pediatric drug use. And so there was movement even as, and again, we're talking about 50 years ago now, right? That there was a need to think about how we could conduct and develop drugs for use in children. And then I think it really started to move more in a speedy, if you will, way in the 1990s. You can see here FDA, in the IOM actually convened a workshop to review the lack of labeling of pediatric drugs. And there was, again, a plan to encourage voluntary submission of pediatric data, and that didn't really fly very well. So in 1997, a law was passed under FDAMA, the Food and Drug and Modernization and Accountability Act, that provided for 6-month marketing exclusivity as an incentive to do studies in children. Shortly after, FDA promulgated a rule that required drug companies under certain conditions to conduct pediatric studies. But you can see that rule was struck down as invalid by the DC federal court because they ruled that we had exceeded our authority to issue this requirement. So ultimately, what happened was that Priya was passed as a legislative effort, was passed into law to actually give FDA that authority. Now, I want to move forward a little bit and talk about what actually happened. So under the Best Pharmaceuticals Act for Children, or BPCA, was introduced in 1997, as I mentioned, as the Better Pharmaceuticals for Children Act. And you can see there was there was bipartisan support and passed in 1997 under FDAMA. Ultimately passed as the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act in 2001, signed into law in early January of 2002. And I might point out that these were passed by unanimous consent in the Senate, and the House used this motion to suspend the rules and pass the bill by voice vote. That's what happens at the end of sessions when Congress wants to pass things quickly. So there was widespread agreement that this was important. And by the way, I have the numbers here. If you look at Priya had, again, introduced by Hillary Clinton when she was a senator from New York in 2002, and then bipartisan sponsorship both in the Senate and the House. And you can see here the same thing. Priya passed the Senate by unanimous consent and passed the House after a motion to suspend the rules and passed by voice vote, signed into law a year later by President Bush. Now, at that time, the Senate was 48 Democrats, 1 independent, and 51 Republicans. And in the House, there were 205 Democrats, 1 independent, 228 Republicans, and 1 vacancy. So, I think that what I want to bring up here is that we're in a different time. We're in a different age, clearly. But it required bipartisan support and working together. So if we talk very briefly about the differences between Priya and BPCA, I'm happy to give a more detailed discussion of this in anybody who wants to listen. Priya is the stick. We can require studies to be conducted under certain circumstances. BPCA is voluntary. We give sponsors incentives to do these studies. If we look at the labeling changes over this was 22 years. We have a little bit more information now. But over half of the labeling changes, successful labeling changes under these two laws occur as a consequence of the requirement. About a little under a quarter related to BPCA, the incentive alone, and then another 14%, you can use both. BPCA is not excluded if you have requirements under PRIA. So these are my thoughts, okay? And I've heard about, we protect women through research, not from research. But I also want to put forward the idea that the health of the child begins with the health of the mother. And I think that's another important marching order that we can use. Statutory requirements, I hope I've proven to you, or my feeling is that they have been successful. We're about to pass or approve our 1,000th labeling change with pediatric specific information. I expect that's going to happen this year. So this is a really red letter year for us. But, and here's the big but, the data required for pregnancy and lactation are different. I think Diana Bianchi mentioned, they're different. We've heard also from others on this panel that they're different. So therapies that have been approved for adults of reproductive potential are also approved for use in pregnancy unless specifically contraindicated. So we don't necessarily need to have the same data package to get what we need for pregnant individuals. And that really needs to inform what kind of legislative efforts we really think are needed. And I want to emphasize that because it's not necessarily, let's just do the same thing for maternal health, for pregnant patients, and we'll just get there. Because I don't think it necessarily fits completely. And finally, my plea to everybody in this room is that we have to consider and we have to collaborate. It's not going to be, it's going to be a compromise, but it's not going to be a communication. It's not going to be, champions in academia saying, or in the Senate saying, okay, well, we're just going to do this full steam ahead, and I'm just communicating to you that we're just going to do this. It's not going to be cooperation either that, well, I just want kind of your agreement that we're going to do this. It's got to be collaboration. It's got to be all of us in this room starting today saying, okay, what can we do here? How can we achieve an effort that's really going to move forward if any legislative effort is going to be successful? And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Catherine.
Thank you. Ditto on your last points. So first of all, thank you. Thank you for including me. I am not a doctor. I have been pregnant several times. I've been pregnant several times since I've started talking about this issue. And the first one is now a teenager, so think about that for a second as well. So I'm Katie Schubert, and I'm president and CEO of the Society for Women's Health Research. I previously worked for the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine, which is where a lot of these conversations on the advocacy side started. I want to talk a little bit about the Coalition to Advance Maternal Therapeutics, which is a coalition that was established formally in 2014, although informal conversations were happening long before that, by the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine, ACOG, March of Dimes, and the American Academy of Pediatrics. That's the steering committee, and SWHR came on to the steering committee 2 years ago when I moved over to SWHR. Initially, this was a joint priority for all of these groups because of all of the things we're talking about over the last 2 days. We were really thinking about what's the information and data that we have on medications that people are taking during pregnancy and or lactation, and we were concerned about the lack of this data, especially when we think about people being either counseled to go off of their medication, counseled to stop breastfeeding, counseled to not even get pregnant. I think there's a lot of different issues surrounding this from sort of what I would call the person's perspective. I also would say, pregnancy is not a disease, much as so really thinking about this as like a life stage is important too. When we were asking people in the field about these questions, we were told we just use what we think or know to be safe because we've been using it for years. We were also told that the categorization of the previous FDA label, which has been updated and I think has been really helpful in this conversation to a narrative from categories, that was confusing for patients, but it also was really confusing for clinicians, even though I think we in this room probably all know what it meant. That was not necessarily clear to sort of folks outside of this room. This also continues to be a common theme throughout SWHR's programming. So at SWHR, we're looking at women's health across the lifespan, and we're looking at a number of different conditions, including pregnancy, but outside of pregnancy. And we hear, I have lupus. I don't think I should have a baby. I finally found a good way to manage psoriatic arthritis or hypertension, you name it. But I've been told I have to go off of this medication while I try to become pregnant or am pregnant. And then my favorite one, which is I have something like uterine fibroids, I should become pregnant so that I can stop having these symptoms, which is also not a therapy for something like that. So there's a lot of questions and a lot of confusion, I think, from the patient perspective. And I would also say I think there's sort of a couple of different issues here that I've heard and I have heard through the PregLac conversations. You know, we're really thinking about both issues that would affect someone going into pregnancy that needs to be managed, or issues that are a result of pregnancy, or pregnancy itself and complications related to pregnancy, and that translates into breastfeeding as well. So when we worked to advocate for the creation of PregLac back in, that work started in 2013, 2014, that became law very quickly. So I just want to make sure I say that too. It became law in 2016. That's not the norm. So we are in sort of this place where we were very lucky to be able to get bipartisan congressional champions to be thinking about this topic, to have an ask that made sense, right? We did start with, let's go out and get a Best Pharmaceuticals for Pregnant People Act. And we sort of took a step back and said, what is the data telling us? What do we already know, and where are we in that place? And that's sort of where the idea for PregLac began. And again, to this idea of it can't just be the researchers who are doing this work. You need the clinicians, you need industry, you need the regulators, and you need the patient perspective. And so I've always been really pleased, and in particular was glad to see Sarah on yesterday's panel as well, talking about her experiences. So I think, you know, there's a lot of things that we need to do. We've heard about the culture shift. There is a roadmap that exists. I think we all probably agree on that from these meetings. It's sort of a matter of what is possible within this perspective right now. And to your point, Dr. Yao, like what is palatable given the current circumstances that we are in politically, but also what's the appetite for work like this. So I think broadly, you know, we have to include all stakeholders across, you know, the process, not just in designing the studies, but really considering like why not this population versus why should we include this population. I think that the congressionally mandated study on ethics and liability is going to be really crucial. I think we're at that place where we've talked about all of the other things and touched upon this. And I know you all touched on it yesterday, so we need to keep talking about that because there needs to be a solution there. We have existing infrastructure that we can leverage to be able to do these studies, and maybe there needs to be more funding for that or an additional push, and that's really where the advocacy groups can come in and that patient voice, as we're calling it. And then the last thing I would say is, and I said this before, right? Like everyone in this room and online, we all know that this is possible and we know kind of what needs to be done. But that's not the perception broadly outside of here. I mean, I spend my days talking about the fact that women were not included in clinical trials until the 90s, and we're still having issues with that. So really meeting people where they are, really scaling up these efforts and raising awareness to engage in training researchers, awareness of clinicians, empowering pregnant and lactating people in their care is what is going to get this across the finish line. But there's still some questions that probably need to be answered first. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much to all four of our amazing panelists. Those were fabulous comments. This takes us to our Q&A, and we're actually going to start with in-person first. So does anybody have a question for one of our panelists?
First of all, thank you to all of you. I mean, these are inspiring and also very practical presentations. And Lynn, especially, shout out, thank you. Whatever you had to do last night to change your presentation. Thank you so much. I have questions for everybody, but I want to ask Iona in the spirit of what Lynn presented. In the spirit of what Lynn presented, and obviously the work that you've done and are doing in the immunization and maternal immunization space shows, right, that it is possible to ethically and practically conduct trials with pregnant women everywhere in the world, or at least many countries in the world. That's pretty important, right, to be able to have that out there for us to help dispel the myth that you can't do research in pregnant people. They won't cooperate, their partners won't cooperate, their cultures won't cooperate, whatever. In the spirit of what Lynn was saying and reflecting on not just Pfizer, but as Ruth Karen was saying, all of the developers of COVID-19 vaccines in this pandemic's decision not to move quickly to get evidence specific to pregnant women, what do you think would help in terms of the kinds of legislative push? I know this puts you in an odd position, but what kinds of things could have been in place that might, you think, change things for through the development of the next pandemic vaccine, when Pfizer will once again, presumably, be leading the way?
Yeah, so I'll speak on behalf of myself as a pediatrician, not on behalf of Pfizer. I do have to say that the FDA has been really fantastic partners in our RSV program, and that's the one that I know most intimately. One example of that is that when we developed our pediatric program in consult with the FDA, we actually included our quote-unquote pediatric participants. Our trial enrolled pregnant persons under the age of 50, and so if you are 16 and you are pregnant, you can enroll in our trial. I cited all of the ways in which the RSV study was able to be capable and competent, but we had the time. We started developing the study in January of 2019 for a start date of June of 2020. And in that time, we actually learned from our GBS and RSV studies. There are plenty of barriers that COVID, I imagine, and other studies run into, not the least of which being that when you submit your studies to anybody, including IRBs, it takes us up to 3 to 4 times longer to go through reviews. We get many challenges, we get many comments back, we often get IRBs saying, even though we are conducting studies in pregnant women with signal signatory, that they should add a signature when we split IRBs with local IRBs. So we really just need improved infrastructure on the receiving end of our applications. And I, as I said, I think the FDA has been a tremendous partner in this, but they are busy with COVID and many other things. And so we always advocate for improved resources on that end. So it's really to have improved resources on the receiving end to be able to give them the capacity and moreover the expertise to respond to our submissions. And I think that would make us move faster. So, we were all surprised pleasantly by the recommendation to use COVID-19 vaccine in December of 2020 in conjunction with somebody's healthcare provider, but that did make it very, very challenging to conduct a placebo-controlled trial. And so with all the off-label use that goes on in pregnancy, what is the decision of a pregnant person to enroll in a placebo-controlled trial when they, in consultation with their doctor, can actually get the medication, the vaccine, without the trial? And so I think a framework for that would be extremely helpful for us, because that's what we really wrestled with through COVID-19. And actually, I think as people know, went back to the FDA in the late fall and suggested that we don't continue a placebo-controlled trial in this environment and instead present the descriptive data from our COVID-19 trial. So you will see that trial is going to be a descriptive trial and not an efficacy or immunogenicity trial as we did with the others because of that implication. So a really good framework for how to conduct trials given off-label use would be helpful.
Go ahead.
It seems like all of us that are doing clinical trials always live under the supervision of an institutional review board. In essence, I think that's the biggest problem with doing these kinds of trials, is getting it through the IRB. I proposed about 3 or 4 years ago a study in cannabis in breastfeeding mothers. And for the first time in 30 years, the IRB actually called me in. And so my colleague and I went up in front and they said, "What the heck are you doing? This is crazy, et cetera." And so we described how we were going to do the trial, et cetera. And so now to this day, every time I walk past the IRB room, I have sphincter problems. So I think our big problem here is that we need to, the government needs to figure out some way to get these people off our back. And to say, listen, if you're going to be on an institutional review board, you need to read some of these requirements and some of these things, because we get all kinds of lay people on there that don't know how important it is to do studies in pregnant or breastfeeding moms. So I think we all live in fear of that, and I actually write protocols now to stay away from IRB problems. And by the way, I learned just through this cannabis study, have you guys heard of a waiver of signed consent? I'm sure many of you
Yes.
have. That was the first time I've ever heard about it. And that was, we used that in women that were smoking cannabis because you didn't have to report them. It's not a reportable offense.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I might just say something that it would be great for the government to help us on that. It's not actually Lynn's issue, though. It's actually with OHRP. And so I think the areas for advocacy there are actually with SACHARP, the Special Advisory Committee and others, because in the same way that FDA has put forth many guidance documents that are helpful, right? So they're not law, but sometimes they're things that FDA can exercise discretion on. There is an opportunity for that sort of information to be put forth from some of our kind of research ethics and compliance groups. But to your point, and I think a little bit of what I was alluding to before, OBGYNs are not routinely in the room in these sorts of meetings or called upon for these kinds of discussions. And so while you might be looking to get someone as an OBGYN with expertise in the room, what that often means is someone who is an OBGYN. That doesn't mean an OBGYN who is doing research. And I wouldn't say that one is any better or worse, but it also depends on what you're looking at and what the need is that you're asking for. And so I do think that there's an opportunity there for not just pregnant women, but to Ruth's point about lactating women. I mean, we've got to get rid of this perception that this is a group that should be viewed exactly the same way, and certainly shouldn't be, I don't think, at all considered a special population because they're actually going through an exposure experience that is simply different. So I think to your point, it becomes about, again, who all are at the room and at the table in this collaborative effort.
Thank you. Oh, yes, please.
So, Tom, I take your point, and Geetha as well. I think what I'm hearing is, and I'm just going to give you the analogy for what happened in FDA after these laws passed. We were kind of muddling along the first 10 years. It wasn't really widely or standardly implemented even within FDA. What happened is in 2007 when Priya and Bpca got reauthorized, they required the creation of a pediatric review committee. And that was finally where we got all the expertise in FDA at the same place reviewing all of these submissions. And I wonder if there's a need, right? Like, we can't make a standard form because standard form doesn't guarantee standard expertise. And I do really believe in those IRBs that they really want to do no harm and do the right thing, and they're scared. And so if we have the right expertise across these IRBs, and we ought to fight for that then I think you might build in the knowledge, the experience, and then the acceptability of some of the things that we're complaining or are really just frustrated about here today.
And even documentation that goes along with that. So like if there is going to be a single IRB, we have done something like before where we've provided kind of a rationale around our decision that then goes along with the sponsor's documents or whoever is coordinating the study that they can provide to other investigators and other IRBs to use as a framework. Doesn't mean they have to agree with it, but at least they can see someone else's rationale rather than saying, oh, University of such approved it, how come you can't? And they're going to just go back to their same logic. Sorry.
Thank you. Go ahead. Thanks for waiting patiently.
There it goes. Now it's going on. Thank you to the panelists and thank you to the previous speakers. I think it's been a really nice morning so far. I think to a lot of the points that are made, I wanted to, Lynn, thank you very much for your presentation about the current environment with pediatrics. And other folks have heard me say this in other forums. It's important to look at all of the aspects of the pediatric policies because there is a dirty underside. And there is a very different foundation upon which pediatrics was built, and that labels were not approved for use in the pediatric population. So legitimately, there were no authorized products for use in pediatrics. So we're working from a place where there are authorized products for use in pediatrics. They're just devoid of important information. So putting in place things that would put studies as requirements, we have to understand what that means and any impact that could have on the access to authorized products. And even with Priya and Bpca, Lynn, the timeline to which authorization of pediatric labels are now in place 30 years later has not moved dramatically. So we can't expect that any statutory laws put into effect to now mandate certain studies, question of what those studies are supposed to generate, is necessarily going to change the generation of the timeline of information related to dosing. So, and I think, Iona, I wanted to add one thing to what you had said about reflecting on the COVID pandemic. I mean, the regulators, the industry, we cannot separate risk from benefit. We're a regulated drug industry. We have to think about risk in our medicines development. That is the foundation upon which the formation of the FDA, the current establishment of it, is based in. We have to look at risk, and there has to be information to inform on risk. So now to my question with this, how do we get to that? And is it a realistic expectation that for every product being developed at the point of an IND is going to be going out of the gate developing with DART studies prior to at what point is a realistic expectation for this information? And what are some of the responsibilities of the broader community for generating priorities for research, for generating models for study to make this more efficient so that we don't have to use animals to do so? What is the commitment to provide all of that information that will actually help to facilitate perhaps getting to smarter approaches to data generation for dosing? Thanks.
So thank you, Christine, for that very thoughtful question. I can always count on Christine for a thoughtful question. We go way back. So let me just say that I agree that the data required for, as I mentioned already, is fundamentally different than what we want for children. And to your point, I think you alluded to about the 8 to 9 year lag between when an adult a drug is approved in adults till we get some pediatric information and labeling is still not great, and we still have problems with that time lag. And we recognize it and are working on it still with innovative study designs, the use of pediatric extrapolation, for example. What I heard yesterday, I think it was Dr. Bettendorf who mentioned this. She mentioned something about full safety information taking 27 years. I heard that comment, and I was very struck by it yesterday. And there you go. We got to do better than that. I think, and again, I am prohibited from, making legislative recommendations. I can give technical advice. And I think one of the things that I think would be important is to really figure out what's missing and how do we reasonably get there, recognizing that there will need to be compromises. And maybe it's not the idea that you need specific studies in pregnant individuals. Maybe it's that you need specific pregnancy data, and that it needs to be presented in a plan, that there's maybe some room for discussion there about what you could reasonably expect to collect. The second point I'll make is about prioritization. We do have some experience recently with the Race for Children Act. That's the Research to Accelerate Cures and Equity. for Children Act, and that changed PRIA for the benefit of children who suffered cancer. And the implementation phase of that was actually almost over 2 years from the time that the bill was signed into law before we actually implemented. And that gave time for stakeholders, and we convened public meetings that include academia, that include industry. We convened public meetings to establish what priorities would need to be in place in terms of the types and ways to consider molecular targets. So there perhaps even is a way to do that either upfront, before, or as a part of whatever you might consider in terms of a legislative approach.
Please.
The other thing I would say is that there are many conversations happening with Capitol Hill about this issue. I can also tell you the conversations are not right now about how do we require these studies. The questions are, how do we get the data, right? So I think that's a really important distinction, and it's also one in which we as advocates spend a lot of time talking about why that is the conversation versus just kind of jumping in and requiring things that may not make sense. So when we talk about data gathering or information sharing, it really is more about what is the infrastructure, what are the right questions to ask, what's missing, to your point. And a lot of these things, the issue of expertise on IRBs, guidance related to how do you conduct this research, what are the questions you might need to ask as a drug sponsor regarding this population, those are things that are probably not necessarily legislated, although I think there's a lot that can be said to raising awareness on. And so when we think about sort of the advocacy side of things, it is slow moving, but we also want to make sure that we're leveraging existing resources that we have available to us to shore those up first, so that then we can determine, okay, what kind of progress are we being made. And then to the prioritization point, I've been asking for years about priorities, and it's really hard when you get people in a room because everybody wants their priority. So I think that's tricky, but I do think it's something that if we had more data on some of this, maybe we could come up with some priorities in terms of where we need to look first. But it's slow moving on purpose, but we also wouldn't want to just go out and try to pass a law that is not going to be helpful to anyone.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah. Gita and Yona, I was intrigued by your descriptions and detailed laying out of how you conduct trials, primarily, I guess, in the US, but we know that many of these trials are global trials. And question to you is, the needs that you laid out about education, experience, expertise, having the right people on the IRBs, but also the site selection. You spoke to the selection of zip codes. At a global level, COVID-19 was actually a striking example where I know that Pfizer was looking for sites to include in low-middle income countries, and that proved to be extremely challenging. And that relates, I think, both to expertise at the investigator level, at the IRB level, but also at the ability of sites to produce background pregnancy, adverse pregnancy rates, etc. So do you have any thoughts on how the pioneering effort that many U.S. institutions are jointly taking on maternal immunization can be translated globally, and this also relates to representation and ultimately access?
Yeah, so I'll start first and then I'll hand it over to Gita. Just talking about the U.S. briefly and our expertise in the U.S., 70% of our principal investigators are obstetricians in the U.S. That's actually flipped. It's 30% globally, but we do require every single trial site to have an investigator that's an obstetrician and a pediatrician. So that was a requirement. I don't think that was really a barrier. I think that all of the sites were able to competently provide that, but it does speak to the expertise agencies globally, and that typically the people that were sort of leading these trials were pediatricians, and then we forced them actually to, if they did not, to go find partnership. We did have a lot of helpful experience in working in low and middle income countries in the RSV trial to set up trials. We have speaking books for our illiterate patients, both US and ex-US, so that literacy is not a barrier to enrollment. We have a 90-day screening period, so maternal participants can be adequately dated in pregnancy and also have a anatomy scan. So we didn't make a sort of background or history or dating ultrasounds a barrier. And that actually, by the way, is really hard to put through IRBs both and internal processes, because nobody likes participants to be hanging around for 90 days before they actually get exposed to the product. That was sort of revolutionary to them, but we brought up the point that you actually have to have adequate prenatal care in order to standardize US and ex-US populations. But certainly in the COVID-19 trial, the startup timelines ex-US prohibit us from going to many countries where I think that a placebo-controlled trial would have worked well. And I really do think that we will continue to work, and we've learned from COVID that we have to work to have existing infrastructure there already from the sponsor side in order that those sites can get up. So it was not a barrier in RSV, but certainly it was in COVID, and that was really sort of the main barrier to continuing the placebo-controlled study ex-US.
Yeah, I think, what I would say from my perspective is if we're thinking of this as a paradigm of change and culture change, right, we have to think about how we can be innovative, right? What have we learned from the last few years that we can do? And what have we learned that we haven't done either? We had opportunities. We aren't talking about Zika anymore, but I'm not sure why, because I don't really think it's gone. It's going to come back up, and we're going to be having these discussions again. Ebola, the next thing, whatever it is. So the question becomes, are we ready to be innovative and think about training and infrastructure development so that we are ready for whatever is next? When we were thinking about avian flu a few years back, everything seems to be a few years back now, but we were working with FDA, we were working with NIAID and our vaccine network to have a on-the-shelf ready protocol and consent document. Why aren't we doing that now, right? So that everyone has common definitions, right? We work through Gaia and the Brighton Collaborative to have those definitions. Why aren't we doing the same thing on what is the playbook for training education? What is the playbook for GCP training? What is the playbook for all of these things that we could take out and have ready, or have individuals, right, poised and ready to go, that we could do that? That takes time, effort, and money. And while I appreciate Dr. Bianchi's discussion this morning, you all know that maternal and pediatric research is the lowest of the rungs. And so getting folks to invest in an infrastructure when it's not a specific product or a specific thing is, yet again, another task. And so at the same time, I think those are the things that we're going to have to do to get us ready for whatever the next thing is, and leverage that for the regular run-of-the-mill work as well. So,
Thank you. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate this conversation. And one of the things I wanted to just kind of touch on, and you both just touched on this beautifully, was to not look at COVID as, oh, see, we had the opportunity we missed. I've been through 3 pandemics in 10 years at the Gates Foundation. We miss every time on a pandemic across every scientific question. I mean, I can't tell you how many conversations I was in COVID where I thought, oh my gosh, this is deja vu all over again. I had the same discussion with these same people 5 years ago on Ebola, and we never learned from it. So don't take that as a disappointment. It's a catalyst to actually move. I think what you're talking about, which I really love, is you're trying to turn this process of studying women into something that's ordinary instead of extraordinary. And so that's partly what pulling all the scientific evidence together in a way that's rational, because you have a lot of experience. You probably have a lot more experience with data on treating pregnant women and lactating women than the pediatric community had when they got started. So I think that's the opportunity, is to pull this together. I can tell you the other challenge that I struggle with all the time: good-intentioned researchers who won't share their data. And we have to get past that. To Lynn's point about being cooperative and collaborative, if we don't all pool it all together and forget about who's going to get the Lancet paper or the New England Journal paper, and instead say, this is how we actually have the body of evidence to build it, then we won't be able to get there. And I think we're heading in the right direction, but we should use the ordinary, everyday times to really get us ready for the extraordinary. Because every time you try to pull out you don't want a new playbook. You want to just use the same playbook, but run it faster, right?
Go ahead.
Thank you for this conversation. Really, really intriguing. I'm particularly intrigued by your thoughts about infrastructure and how we can change the infrastructure of data gathering. Like, how do we get the data is the key question here, right? We need the data. It seems like, with the majority of pregnant women taking some form of prescription medication, this is like a missed opportunity as a nation and probably as a whole society to collect data that on women who are taking these medications that could then inform us in the future. I'm curious your thoughts on like an opt-out method as opposed to an opt-in method, right? So right now when we have our large databases like through Mother to Baby, the Otis database, it's patients have to actively opt in, right? What is the prospect for and how would this be done? I'm curious with the electronic medical record, we have records of every drugs patients are taking or that they've been prescribed. I guess we don't know if they're taking them, but we have records of what patients have been prescribed. How can we come up with some form of infrastructure that automatically puts those drugs into some form of system that we then can track electronically the outcomes of those pregnancies? Is there a thought for that? And then patients they're automatically opted in, and they could maybe elect to opt out if they don't want to be, but I think that would give us a massive amount of data. I don't know if that's feasible.
I love this idea. I've been trying to get it for many years. EMRs don't talk to each other, and after you give birth to a child, your prenatal record disappears. It still exists, but you can't recall it quickly, which is another issue related to maternal mortality. So I'll try not to go off on a tangent on that. But I think that's a huge opportunity. We at SWHR, but I also know SMFM, ACOG, and this may be something for the coalition to take up in the future as well, is really working with OSTP to talk about this problem. How do you use the opportunities available to you? So we also not only think about electronic medical records and data related there, but pregnancy exposure registries. How do we make sure that clinicians are aware of them? So if you're already on something, why not just try to enroll? But then I think, to your point as well, the data on the back end is also a problem. So like, even if it goes somewhere, how do you get it? And particularly if you're a patient, how do you get that data? You don't have access to it at all. And so really thinking about, is there a way to have something in one place? Like I know FDA has their pregnancy exposure registries all in one place. I will say, and I have not looked recently, but when we had our very first conversation about this back in 2014, we thought, oh, well, let's just go see what we can get out of one registry. And we went to the website and it literally said, yes, a registry exists. Please write a letter to this person to get the data and information. So I would venture a guess that it's probably not all that different. It's not like you can go online and just get the information. And I think that's also part of the piece with the label itself, right? Like it's great to know that there is a pregnancy exposure registry now through that narrative label, but again, access to the data is a real challenge. And so I think from the patient perspective, that's something that we're really hoping to tackle.
Go ahead.
Sabra Inkner from AmChip. I just want to, push back a little bit on that broadly in that I think that all of us in this room are like, sure, take my data, whatever. That's not universal. And, when we know how hard it is to get people to enroll in trials, imagine, oh, yeah, we're just using your data. We're not telling you, especially, but not exclusively for things that are stigmatizing, for medications that are stigmatizing, for diagnoses that are stigmatizing in a population that is stigmatized. And with the lessening ability to truly say that something is anonymized or even de-identified, which also disproportionately impacts smaller populations, smaller communities who are also more likely to be marginalized. And so I really, consent can happen, but it has to happen. In my opinion, we can't get away from this idea that it's too hard to get consent from people. So, it is hard, and EHR, connectivity is a problem, and ability to use data is a problem. But just because we have, possession is not 9/10 of the law. Just because we have data does not mean that it's ours to use and share.
Thank you so much. That unfortunately will have to be our last question, but we have plenty of time with our coffee break and bio break to follow to continue the discussion. I just want to sort of draw together the really practical points that these panelists have made and thank them for their time. I think we've really heard about the importance of ensuring that IRB expertise is standardized and that our IRB members have the education and resources they need to do their job well. I really love the example from the RSV study of how to do community-centered, patient-based clinical trials in an equitable fashion, and then love the ideas for legislative change. And I think really as the take-home point is that we need to emphasize the outcome that we want, which is data, rather than the process, which is clinical trials. So I think that's a really great resounding take-home point from this panel. Thank you all so much.